Philosophers, do they bang? And if so, how much? Because philosophers' personal lives deeply and intimately shape their philosophies. And by understanding their biographies, including their sexual biographies, we can also understand how they think we should live our lives and what these philosophers think we owe others in the world. It's also interesting to understand whether their philosophies can be useful and applied to private lives, whether a philosopher's romantic history might also help us form a sexual ethics from their philosophies. So in this video on the sex lives of philosophers, let's get to the bottom of—
That's what she said!
Nope, no, none of that. This is a serious video on serious issues. So no double entendres, no cheap jokes, no puns, no sexual innuendos, or fun of any kind. We are doing philosophy here after all. And after we've seriously and soberly considered the sex life of each philosopher, we can rank them. No? Philibot says no. Oh well, no ranking. Maybe. So instead, we'll get into Diogenes' self-pleasure in the marketplace. We'll get into the Marquis de Sade's sex life. We'll get into Nietzsche's sad love triangle. We'll get into de Beauvoir's romantic triumphs, and a little bit of clubbing with Foucault and Deleuze for a big finish. Now, we're going deep and hard into some very intimate territory, so let's— Wait, no. But today we're exploring positions we've never considered before, so— Oh, come on. Well, let's not waste any time because we've got a lot of philosophical encounters to fit into a tight— I give up. Let's just roll the credits because it's Philibot After Dark. And to make sure there's absolutely no smut whatsoever, nothing salacious, just serious, high-minded philosophy, here's the roadmap. First, we'll look at ancient philosophy, like the Greeks, who argued extensively about human nature, and particularly our sexual nature, asking, should we be ashamed of our animal urges and our sexual selves? And what role do norms play in restraining our desires? Secondly, we'll look at Christian self-denial in early religious thinkers like St. Augustine and Abelard, and the inevitable scandal that followed, you know, when God granted them chastity, just not yet. Then, number 3, it's time to turn to the juicy stuff, the confessions, and the roles that sexual desire and rational restraint played in a European intellectual revolution. It's an erotic enlightenment that covers Rousseau fantasizing about his nursemaid to, well, everything about the Marquis de Sade. Our fourth foray will be into the romantic rebellion that followed that Enlightenment and the passionate but shady cast of characters caught in its wake, like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. In our fifth flirtation, we'll look at love and lust in the face of world wars, with liberated thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir and lechers like Bertrand Russell, before sixthly and finally considering some contemporary philosophers like Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze, who may be a bit too liberated for some tastes. So let's get cracking and— Wait, no, that one's fine. So let's get cracking and whip ourselves up into a philosophical lather. When people say the ancients were wiser, they usually mean ancients like Plato and Aristotle. But if you actually time traveled back to Athens, I'd argue that the real fun was happening down the street, with a barrel-dwelling troll named Diogenes and a hedonic life coach called Aristippus. Honestly, these guys make Socrates look like a designated driver. Take Diogenes of Sinope, for example. As mentioned, he lived in the ancient version of a wine cask. He begged for scraps on the streets, and he believed that virtue meant throwing out every social convention while deciding for yourself what the truth was. He also, according to numerous horrified chroniclers, masturbated in public, constantly. When people told him to stop, usually he just shrugged and replied, "If only I could cure hunger by rubbing my belly." His point was that everything is just an urge, and for him, the true scandal was a society that let its most vulnerable go hungry, not one that let its most horny fondle themselves on the streets. Sure, it's not exactly Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, but for me, it has the ring of truth to it. What Diogenes was really asking was, what is shame? And on hearing the answer, he argued, Are human urges really what we should be ashamed of? Or is it a useful distraction from the real problems that we should be solving? Because for Diogenes, shame was an invention, and sex was just another bodily function. He argued that dogs and animals didn't feel guilty about it, so why should we? And perhaps that's also how he got his nickname, Diogenes the dog. You know, the Stoics preached emotional control, but clearly some philosophers were more hands-on in their research.
Hey, that's what she said.
No, but Diogenes also pushed the logic further. For example, he argued that marriage was just a property contract and not a natural state. He said that perhaps it was better to have women held in common and to recognize, quote, no other marriage than the union of the man who persuades with the woman who consents. In other words, no divine law, no ownership, just persuasion and consent. You might call this proto-polyamory. You might also call it a great way to get uninvited from a dinner party. If Diogenes was the prototype of the shameless exhibitionist, then Aristippus of Cyrene was the functional hedonist. He loved courtesans, which is fancy speak for prostitutes. He loved fine wine and luxury, but he insisted that he wasn't enslaved by them. His most famous line about his affair with the courtesan Lais said, "I have Lais, not she me," which is a much classier way of saying I can quit anytime I want. He'd walk in and out of brothels unapologetically, telling his students the problem isn't going in, it's not being able to leave. So we might not be with him on this one, particularly given that at the time in ancient Greece, many of those courtesans might have been slaves. But we can take at least a small lesson from Aristippus's, let's say, interesting sex life, because he also delighted in poking holes in sexual double standards. When he was criticized for loving a woman who'd been with many men, he replied, quote, "Is there a difference between living in a house where many have lived and one where no one has? Then why should it matter with women?" It's, in its way, a defense of sexual freedom 2,000 years before Twitter. It's also about as problematic, given that at the time a man could own both the house and the woman. But I highlight them of all the ancient Greeks because firstly, I disqualified any philosopher who theoretically slept with underage use, and that pretty much decimated the entire ancient philosophy cohort, let me tell you. But also because Diogenes and Aristippus represent two ends of a very ancient spectrum. One said, simplify, do it in public, live like a dog, follow your passions, come what may. And the other said, enjoy the pleasures, but keep the leash in your own hands. Both saw sex as natural, not as sinful, and both mocked the idea that being moral meant repressing one's desires. And the thing is, they weren't necessarily wrong. Well, about some things. Because Diogenes' cynicism reminds us that a lot of sexual morality is just performance. It's an etiquette of shame. While Aristippus' hedonism reminds us that the real ethical questions isn't, did you do it? But are you free in doing it, or are you enslaved by it? And that, my friends, is the difference between a philosopher and a guy with a Pornhub premium subscription and a problem. So if the ancients knew how to party, then the early Christians knew how to feel guilty about it. And no one felt guilt with quite as much literary flair as Augustine of Hippo, patron saint of sexual hangovers, and then, after his death, an actual saint. Because Augustine spent his 20s doing what every future bishop of the Christian church does. You know, taking a concubine, fathering a son, and praying nightly for God to fix his libido, just not too quickly. In his famous Confessions, Augustine looks back at his youth as a slow-motion train wreck of desire. As a teenager, he prayed to God, "Grant me chastity and continence, but not yet." And the "not yet" is doing all of the work here. It's the greatest line in the history of procrastination because he wanted virtue, just not at the cost of the fun he was having right now. Augustine knew what the goal was: holiness, purity, and self-control, for him at least. But he also had a concubine, and he had a son named Anti-Oedipus, and what he himself called, quote, a seething cauldron of lust. What a great band name. He wanted to be chaste someday, just preferably after one more round. Now, eventually he gave up the woman he loved, and theoretically the son he did too, and that heartbreak became his theology, because out of this heartbreak, Augustine built a theology that has haunted Western bedrooms ever since. He argued that sex after the fall is corrupted by lust, That even in marriage, the involuntary twitch of arousal is a mark of original sin. Procreation, that was fine, but pleasure, that was a venial sin for St. Augustine. Adam and Eve had stayed obedient to God, Augustine claimed, then he thought that they could have reproduced without any lust at all, just like calm little gardeners propagating in the Garden of Eden. And it's a vision of Eden that's kind of depressing. Augustine's legacy is double-edged. He insisted that marriage was good against people like the Manichaeans who called all sex evil. But he also insisted that sexual pleasure itself was shameful, even between spouses. And that tension between affirming love and condemning lust set the stage for centuries of Christian ambivalence. This mix of affirmation and suspicion that marriage is good and lust is bad hardened into centuries of Christian ambivalence about sex. And if Augustine provided the theory, then Peter Abelard and Eloise supplied the case study. Because if Augustine was the theologian of chastity, then Abelard was the case study in its hypocrisies. Abelard was a rock star of intellectual 12th century Paris. He was brilliant, he was arrogant, and he was utterly reckless. Abelard was a famed teacher who seduced his teenage student, Eloise. Their letters describe an affair that was equal parts passionate and manipulative. Abelard even admits that he targeted her because she loved learning and would therefore consent. And by her own account, Eloise recalls that, quote, they left no stage of lovemaking untried. It was less a courtly romance and it was more a crash course in, let's say, extracurriculars. When Eloise became pregnant, Abelard arranged a secret marriage to placate her uncle. But bravely, Eloise resisted. She argued that she wasn't against love and marriage as a recognition or a union of that love, but she was against the hypocrisy of dressing it up as bourgeois respectability. She later wrote, quote, if Augustus, emperor of the world, offered me marriage, I would rather be called your whore than his empress. And that is not repentance, that's defiance. For Eloise, the scandal wasn't the problem, the scandal was the truth. And the fallout from this position was brutal. Eloise's uncle hired men to break into Abelard's room and to castrate him. Their romance ended in literal blood. Abelard retreated into monastic life and rebranded their passion as a sin God had punished to save his soul, which, to be honest, is But Eloise refused to be rewritten. In letter after letter, she insists, quote, I am not penitent of the past. I weep only for my lover. She would not allow doctrine to erase the purity and the innocence of her own desire. And that's the tragic irony, because two holy men of the church struggled to change and then tried to hide the truth of their desire. Augustine tried to baptize his lust into guilt, and Abelard tried to sermonize his affair into a moral fable. But Eloise refused to be rewritten. She remained loyal to the lived experience of love, however scandalous it was, and however much she was condemned.
Shame! Shame!
In her voice, we hear the critique that Christianity itself rarely dared admit, that love and pleasure are not errors waiting to be corrected, but truths in their own right. So when we talk about Christian sexual ethics, things like chastity, marriage, virtue, we're really talking about this triangle between Augustine's guilt, Abelard's hypocrisy, and Eloise's resistance. Augustine gave the church, unfortunately, its suspicion of desire, whereas Abelard illustrated how badly the theory can collapse in practice. And Eloise, centuries ahead of her time, demanded honesty. She demanded that we don't call this a sin, that we call it grace, and that we call it what it is, lust, in the most positive of senses, and love. But next, let's turn to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and the Marquis de Sade, two men who on the face of it could not have been more different, except for the fact that they both left their sticky little fingerprints all over the way we think about sex, about politics, and about morality. One dreamed of innocence, while the other revelled in transgression. And if Rousseau was the patron saint of guilty desire, then de Sade was the prophet of guilty pleasure, minus the guilt. Following in Augustine's footsteps, Rousseau's Confessions similarly turns his autobiography into philosophy. In one way, it's kind of a hymn to sincerity and to exposing yourself to the world without disguise, which Rousseau does in that text. For example, in the book, he confesses that at the age of 8, he was spanked by his governess, Mademoiselle Lambercier, and to his surprise, it aroused him. He writes that this, quote, determined my tastes, my desires, my passions for the rest of my life. But that's the Enlightenment for you. Everybody else is writing about reason and progress, while Rousseau is writing about how his libido was rewired by corporal punishment. And apparently the kink followed him into adulthood. He admits to staging chance encounters in alleyways where he would accidentally expose his rear to women hoping for a slap. Later, he became the lover of Madame de Varenne, a woman he called maman or mother. And I don't like to kink shame, but for Rousseau, de Varenne was part lover, part adopted mother, and altogether entirely a Freudian jackpot. And while he was confessing these quirks, Rousseau was also fathering 5 children with another woman, his long-suffering partner who he eventually and begrudgingly but illegally married. He deposited every single one of these kids with a foundling hospital, never to see them again. And this from the philosopher who argued most strenuously in his age for the rights of others, for respect for others, and for equality. Voltaire famously called Rousseau's private behaviour monstrous. While I think we can find it a little bit ironic, but all too predictable that the man who wrote Emile, a treatise on the proper education of children, wouldn't even raise or educate his own. What ties all of this together is Rousseau's conviction that sex and society do not fit. Indeed, even in the Holy Candid Confessions, you can feel Rousseau's toxic shame radiating off the page. In The State of Nature, he imagined sex was simple, casual, without jealousy. Instead, he argues that civilization has ruined it by inventing things like chastity, marriage, and family honour. You know, exactly the sort of things that St. Augustine was talking about. But for Rousseau, the spanking fetish wasn't something necessarily to repent. Instead, it was a reminder that desire sprouts where it will, and that our bodies don't obey social scripts. Rousseau's message was also that it's too much about self-love, about pride, about vanity, about the obsession with appearances, and that poisons the natural love. But in practice, Rousseau was still a man that, to borrow another philosopher's phrase, was human, all too human. And the secret shame that drove his finest works of philosophy also drove his most monstrous private acts. But what if Rousseau wasn't completely shamed by his perceived perversions and bad behaviour? Well, then you'd have his evil twin, the infamous Marquis de Sade, a man who was, yes, a philosopher in his own right, and possibly one of the most underappreciated in the history of philosophy, as he pioneered a form of critique and philosophical genealogy, as well as an intentionally controversial style that would really only come into its own later when wielded by another equally divisive philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. Where Rousseau said that society corrupts man who is naturally good, de Sade replies, society corrupts man who is naturally cruel. Where Rousseau felt guilty about getting spanked, de Sade wants to do the spanking, with a whole bunch of accessories to add to the party. And you could argue that the Marquis de Sade lived the fantasy that Rousseau never dared, although as we see, he paid for it too. De Sade whipped prostitutes, he sodomized servants, he staged orgies with Spanish fly, and he spent half of his life in a prison or an asylum because of it. His books, like Justine, Juliet, 120 Days of Sodom, are encyclopedias of cruelty masquerading as philosophy. They argue things like that since nature creates both life and death indiscriminately, there is no crime in imitating nature's cruelty. He argued that virtue was a sham, that only desire and the reality of that desire is real. Now, we can become outraged and object to the content of these novels, which, to be honest, I think is exactly what de Sade wants. Or we can look deeper and recognise that de Sade is also anticipating trends like psychoanalysis by about a century. Because as terrible as de Sade is, there's also always a sense in his work that he's not inventing the perversions and some of the worst impulses of mankind, but simply documenting them. As one of his characters declares, quote, "Crime is the soul of lust. What would pleasure be if it were not accompanied by crime?" And that's the Sadean gospel. Pleasure is never innocent, and it always tastes better when it breaks a law. And I'll let you decide how you feel about that one. But for me, the best example of how far he takes these philosophical ideas isn't even his pornography, but in his politics. In 1785, as the French Revolution lurched from monarchy to terror to directory, de Sade published a pamphlet tucked inside his book Philosophy in the Bedroom. The title of the pamphlet was, quote, "Yet another effort, Frenchmen, if you would become Republicans." And it's a banger.
That's what she said.
No, the work is part a philosophical treatise and part an erotic prank, and it's funny. He performs what philosophers call a reductio ad absurdum on the fundamental principles of the French Revolution, showing that, when taken to their logical conclusion, their so-called reasonable and rational principles end in nothing but absurdity. Frenchmen, he argues, haven't gone far enough. They've guillotined the king. They've exiled the priests, but they've left the final pillar of that old order, Christian morality, still standing, for no other reason than their own sentimentality. And de Sade argues that as long as guilt and chastity rule the bedroom, you are not free. So what does true Republican virtue require? Well, according to de Sade, it requires the abolition of marriage. It requires the legalization of divorce. It requires the acceptance of homosexuality and the complete equality of sexual freedom for women. He writes, "You charming sex, you will be free. Like men, you will enjoy all the delights that nature made your obligation. No other limits than your leanings, no other laws than your cravings." It's astonishing. The same man notorious for torturing women in his texts is also the one calling for their emancipation. Of course, his idea of equality was that women should be just as free to commit debauchery and cruelty as men. It's not quite feminism, it's more equal opportunity depravity. Still, there's a kernel of radical truth here. And to be honest, it's more philosophical opportunity than women have been offered in generations at that point. But what de Sade is saying here is that if you really want liberty, you can't stop at the barricades. You have to liberate desire itself. In that sense, his pamphlet is a parody of Rousseau. Rousseau thought that freedom meant educating citizens to control their passions. De Sade instead thought freedom meant letting people do what they feel. It's a clever trap, because we either have to agree with de Sade and satisfy his desire to do whatever he feels, or we have to admit, against Rousseau, that some of the fundamental principles on which we base our freedom may be flawed. Well played, de Sade, well played. But what unites Rousseau and de Sade is the conviction that sex is political. Rousseau thought that sex revealed the corruption of civilization. De Sade thought that it revealed the corruption of morality itself. And while Rousseau preached natural innocence but abandoned his children, becoming a public hero and a private hypocrite, de Sade abandoned morality itself and preached cruelty as the highest law, avoiding all hypocrisy but becoming a villain in the process. One died paranoid and solitary, remembered as the sentimental father of democracy. The other died in a madhouse, remembered as the father of sadism. And both, in their different ways, remind us that the Enlightenment philosophy was never just about reason. It was also about bodies and desires and some awkward truths we'd rather not confess. And 2 centuries later, we're still not sure whether to read some of these texts as philosophy, as pornography, or prophecy. And that brings us to, and I'll admit there's no avoiding it, the single most saddest sex life in philosophy, Friedrich Nietzsche. He was the prophet of the Übermensch, the hammer of morality, the man who declared God dead and who probably died a virgin. It's not certain, but his romances were so thin on the ground that biographers treat one visit to the brothel like it was his moon landing. Some say he caught syphilis there. Others think the disease that ruined his body and mind might have been something else entirely, a congenital disorder or a stroke, or maybe even mercury poisoning from some quack medicine. Whatever the diagnosis, the legend persists. Nietzsche went looking for love in a brothel and came out with a death sentence. But the truth, as Nietzsche would always caution us, is probably a lot more messy partially hidden, and difficult. Personally, I think Nietzsche was technically unlucky in love because he had in his mind an ideal partner that was almost impossible to find at that time. He wanted a highly educated woman in a society that didn't value educating women. He wanted an equal partner in an age that didn't recognize equality, and he wanted an independent spirit in a system that allowed such privileges only to men. And yet, he found her. It was his greatest heartbreak, the one that defined his personal life. It was an aristocratic emigre and child, but when he met her adult, prodigy, Lou Andrea Salome. She was brilliant. She was fiercely independent, and she was predictably 20 years his junior. But to be honest, I don't think that would have bothered Nietzsche in the slightest if she was 20 years his senior. That was how deeply he fell for her. And Nietzsche fell for her at once and proposed marriage not once, but twice. She refused both times. In fact, she refused numerous offers of marriage from a range of suitors because she knew that once married, she would never have her independence again. In fact, Lou wanted something quite different. She wanted a circle of friends and intellectual companionship without the chains of organized society and marriage. Together with Nietzsche's friend Paul Riesz, the three planned a kind of chaste menage, a trinity devoted to philosophy, to friendship, and to freedom. The problem was that Nietzsche was already too deeply in love, as was Riesz. Although, just between us, Nietzsche was the only one who was really a truly honourable gentleman about it. He wanted Lou as a wife, and Lou wanted Nietzsche as a comrade, and Riesz was caught conniving jealously in the middle. The trio even staged a photograph that would become infamous. Lou sitting in the cart holding a whip, while Nietzsche and Riesz stand in front of her as if they were beasts of burden. It was meant as a joke, but it turned into a prophecy. Nietzsche would later write, quote, "When you go to woman, do not forget the whip." One of his most controversial aphorisms. Scholars still debate whether he meant it literally, metaphorically, or ironically. But in that photo, the whip is firmly in Lou's hand, and Nietzsche is already the one being led. When Salome rejected him, Friedrich Nietzsche unraveled. His letters to her, passionate, desperate, sometimes rambling, were ignored or returned. He retreated into solitude, hiking the Alps, writing feverishly, producing works like Thus Spoke Zarathustra that shimmer with longing and with bitterness. In Zarathustra, he describes a craving for love that remains unsatisfied. And in another work, Beyond Good and Evil, he declares, quote, "In the end, every man loves his desire more than the thing desired," which is another way of saying that the fantasy is always sweeter than the difficulties of the relationship itself. Salome, meanwhile, went on to live the very life that Nietzsche could never have. She studied with Freud. She became one of the first female psychoanalysts, and she had passionate affairs with artists like Rainer Maria Rilke and others. She married Riesz, but it was a formality. Riesz had to settle for an open marriage. And where Nietzsche sublimated his desire into aphorisms, Lou embraced it, she analysed it, and she lived it. To me, the contrast is brutal. While Nietzsche collapsed into loneliness, Salome thrived in freedom. He became the solitary prophet of modern nihilism, while she became a living experiment in erotic and intellectual independence. And Nietzsche's philosophy of sex, or what we can make of it, reflects this fracture. He despised Christian morality for branding desire as guilt, and he thought chastity was only a virtue for the strong. For the weak, he thought it was a poison. In one of his more feral aphorisms, he sneers, quote, "These are continent, to be sure, but doggish lust looks enviously out of all they do." Which, I don't know, describes a few of the darker corners of the internet. And he understood the repression of desire all too well too. He argued, a bit grossly but convincingly, that under every saint's robe lies a panting animal. And as we've seen, it was certainly true for St. Augustine. And Nietzsche, understandably, was bitter. He distrusted love itself. He saw romance as a form of power and a disguised struggle for dominance, often comparing love to war with jealousy as its battlefield. The whip, for him, was not only a kinky accessory, but also a symbol of the asymmetry of that desire. For Nietzsche, someone always dominates. Someone always surrenders. There is no equality in passion. And sadly, in Nietzsche's personal case, we know who always came off worse. It was him. For all of his bravado, Nietzsche's private letters were filled with loneliness. He writes, quote, "The lack of a truly healing human love, the absurd isolation that wounds me, that is very bad indeed." This is not the Übermensch speaking, but a man who has had his heart broken. And for a thinker obsessed with strength, it is the ultimate irony that his own sex life was a wound that he could never overcome. When we read Nietzsche, it should be a caution for us too. And so we end with a paradox. Nietzsche, who wanted to tear down the old morality, remained trapped in his own loneliness. Salome, who wanted the freedom, lived it. Nietzsche killed God, but he could not get the girl. And Salome whipped the philosopher, walked away, and then went to bed with the poet. And quite a few other people too. Good for her. It's also why I think that Nietzsche's is the saddest sex life in philosophy. It's not because Nietzsche lacked desire, but because he had too much of it. And not because he feared women, but because he longed desperately for their independent, equal companionship. And the horrible irony is that Nietzsche's passion, his bitterness, his railing against the world is really only the periodic shade in his works that makes the rest of his life-affirming philosophy sparkle. Nietzsche is constantly being hijacked by the worst sorts of people. Anti-Semites he despised, like his sister Elizabeth, or Prussian militarists he denounced, Nazis he would have abhorred, and manosphere preachers that would have baffled him. But reading his biography, his private letters, I find a gentleman of decency and of genuine feeling, who treated others like Lou Salome much better than other people of that time did. Yes, he was human, all too human, to borrow one phrase again. But to borrow another, his intimate life really was a birth of tragedy. By the 20th century, sex and philosophy stopped being side stories in the margins of these dusty biographies. Suddenly, sex itself is part of the main act, with arguments, with scandals, with bad faith, and with manifestos on sex forming part of the philosophical works themselves. And no two lives show this better than Simone de Beauvoir and Bertrand Russell. Both preached sexual freedom. Both lived it with varying degrees of, let's say, success. And both discovered that writing about desire is easier than surviving its labyrinth. Because Simone de Beauvoir detonated the entire conversation about sex with a single book called The Second Sex. She famously wrote that, quote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." And she single-handedly tore through centuries of assumption that biology was destiny. Sex, she showed, was not just a private act. It was an engine of women's oppression, a stage where freedom and domination were played out, not too far from the Marquis de Sade, a theme that we'll see recurring in a lot of later philosophers' work who owe her a big debt. But her own life was no tidy illustration of the theory. She and Jean-Paul Sartre, who we've discussed before, had what they called a pact. They were essential loves between each other, but they opened up their relationship to pursue what they called contingent loves on the side. In practice, this meant a carousel of lovers, affairs, and emotional wreckage, often involving their students, and quite a few novels and plays they wrote about the aftermath. They would seduce, sleep around, and then narrate the details to each other and to audiences like existentialist voyeurs. Later accusations make the picture a whole lot darker. De Beauvoir was accused of grooming her young female students and was even suspended from teaching in 1943. The scandal is hard to square with her philosophical insistence on respecting the freedom of others. Was it freedom or exploitation in the name of freedom? I'll let you decide. And yet, here's what makes de Beauvoir different from almost everyone else we've seen so far. She knew it was messy. She admitted it. In The Ethics of Ambiguity, she wrote that freedom is never pure. Our choices entangle us with others. Our desires pull against our ideals, and our attempts to live authentically sometimes collapse into hypocrisy. She didn't hide from the contradictions, and she did make them a part of her analysis. Whether that excuses her transgressions, I'll leave that up to the comments section. But it is also why, for all of the legitimate criticism of her behaviour, de Beauvoir stands out as oddly frank. She understood that sexual ethics in the modern world is not about a single formula, but it's about compromises and tensions. It's about failures that really can't be ironed out. In that sense, her personal life was both an experiment, sometimes spectacularly unsuccessful, and also a cautionary tale. Bertrand Russell, meanwhile, tried to apply the cool precision of logic to the hot mess of sex. And like everything he did as a philosopher, he did it poorly. In Marriage and Morals, written in 1929, for example, he was ahead of his time and advocated for divorce, for contraception, for homosexuality, and for women's sexual freedom. A lot of freedoms that we just take for granted now. But for 1929, this was dynamite. He even lost a post teaching in New York because the parents thought he was morally unfit to be around their daughters, which, incidentally, he was, but we'll get to those stories. And Russell conveniently argued that jealousy was not a natural but a cultural construct, a leftover of property thinking that chained love to ownership. But when you turn from his philosophy to his life, the contradictions pile up. He was married 4 times, he carried on countless affairs, including with T.S. Eliot's wife, and he found himself eaten up by the very jealousy he claimed to have outgrown. He admitted in his letters that his jealousy was, quote, a form of madness. But that's bloody Bertrand Russell for you. He could dismantle Euclidean geometry, but not his own possessiveness. Because Russell wanted love without ownership and sex without hypocrisy. But in practice, he often left behind bitterness, divorce papers, and children who later described him as cold and absent. His public philosophy promised liberation, but his private life often showed its cost. Pair Russell and de Beauvoir, and you see the problem laid bare. The sexual freedom is easy to demand, but it's almost impossible to live. Russell rationalised his way into ideals he couldn't even personally sustain, and de Beauvoir, for all of her faults, at least admitted that the contradictions were baked in. Her philosophy of ambiguity fits the facts, that sex isn't clean, that freedom and exploitation overlap, and that desire can be both liberating and destructive in the same bed. And so that's why in the modern era, I think things get explosive, as philosophers get more comfortable talking publicly about the sex lives that we all have. And with de Beauvoir and Russell, sex stops being a secret weakness or a libertine provocation. Instead, it becomes something of a social experiment. And it's also a political statement and a bit of a minefield of freedom and betrayal. And the explosions from that minefield are still echoing. By the late 20th century, philosophers had given up on the pretense that sex was just an embarrassing side issue. They were writing about it openly, obsessively, even gleefully, and experimenting with the issue not just in lecture halls, but in nightclubs, in manifestos, and in the thick of social upheaval. And at the centre of this explosion are 2 philosophers I spent a lot of time reading, Michel Foucault and Gilles Deleuze. Now, Foucault is usually remembered as a philosopher of power, and particularly as the thinker that told us that sexual identity and its discourses aren't repressed, but are actively produced. In his landmark work, The History of Sexuality, he points out that many of the historical stories we tell ourselves about sex are wrong. Like the claim that the Victorian era banned sex, when in fact, both perversely and productively, it talked about sex to death. Whether it's doctors, priests, school teachers, police officers, in Foucault's argument, they were all active in creating and enforcing new kinds of categories, new discussions about sex, new names, and new kinds of people. Foucault even concludes that many of the ideas of sexuality, as we understand them, are not eternal identities, but inventions of power. In that sense, for Foucault, sexuality as we know it is less a biological truth and more a police report. And Foucault lived it. He spent his nights in San Francisco bathhouses, calling these limit experiences, pushing the body to its edge, testing what new forms of selfhood might emerge. For him, for example, BDSM wasn't escapism, it was fieldwork. Some philosophers say, know thyself. Foucault preferred, tie me up, blindfold me, and let's see what I become. He might even have gotten along with Sade. But in his later work, something softened. In the last 2 volumes of The History of Sexuality, Foucault turns back to the ancient Romans and Greeks. He finds a different model of ethics, which is one not based on commandments or on sin, but on what he called the care of the self. Because for the ancients, on Foucault's reading, sex was not a shameful secret or a crime against God. Instead, it was a force to cultivate, a pleasure to be enjoyed, sure, but also a fundamental element of identity to be considered and developed. He moved to a very familiar, almost stoic position of seeing sex and sexual identity not as repression, not as indulgence, but instead as a practice of moderation and of shaping your impulses into a style of life. And that's the arc of Foucault's career, from prisons and panopticons to the pleasures of the flesh to a vision of sex as self-making. More broadly, he saw the purpose of the kind of freedoms we are allowed and can cultivate as essential in the art of living, tending desire like a garden, pruning it, training it, and ultimately shaping it into something beautiful. After 2 millennia of guilt and repression, he hands us back a very old idea: sex as a practice and sex as care. So yes, Foucault was the philosopher of limits, but he was also, by the end, a philosopher of balance. The real climax of his thought
That's what she said.
That's my joke. Damn it, Dwight.
wasn't just that sexuality is produced by power, it was that pleasure can be cultivated gracefully into the better lives and freer societies. But if Foucault made sex about power, then the philosopher Gilles Deleuze made it about creativity. Together with the psychoanalyst Félix Guattari, he wrote Anti-Oedipus, a book that reads kind of like Freud rewritten by Hunter S. Thompson. Their argument was simple and insane. Freud was wrong. Desire isn't lack. Desire isn't a hole you're trying to fill with mummy or daddy or whatever happens on Tinder. For Deleuze, desire is productive. It builds machines. It flows. It connects. He and Guattari talk about desiring machines, about bodies without organs, and the natural concept of the rhizome. It all sounds like gibberish until you realize they're trying to imagine sex, but without all the usual family romance baggage and what they saw as bankrupt, regressive Freudianism. They argued that we should stop picturing sex as neurotics in therapy, as something to be solved, and instead understand desire as the electricity that runs through bodies and through politics, through economies, through arts, and through capital. Pornhub and Wall Street, they point out before their own time, are powered by the same circuits. Sex sells, and our modern economies run on the erotic charge of selling. So if Freud made everything about your mother, Deleuze made everything about your toaster. And in its own mad way, it works. Put Foucault and Deleuze together and you get the strangest buddy cop film never made. Foucault, with his bald head gleaming under the club lights, mutters power produces sexuality, while Deleuze, chain-smoking sullenly in the corner, replies, and sexuality produces reality. But both land on the same truth. Sex isn't timeless. It isn't just natural instinct. It's a battlefield where power works on us, and a workshop where desire builds new possibilities. Our categories, whether they're gay or straight or kinky or vanilla or whatever, they're not eternal. They're something like performances or repetitions or scripts we inherit, and most importantly, they can also be rewritten. But neither philosopher left us a neat system, and they too met a tragic end. Foucault died in 1984 at the height of the AIDS crisis, still refusing to recant the pleasures he'd lived. And Deleuze, sick and suffocated by illness, hurled himself out of a Paris apartment window in 1995. Their lives ended abruptly and tragically, but their challenge didn't. They called for us to stop treating sexuality as a solved riddle and instead treat it as an experiment that is happening every single day. And for philosophy, it means that the bedroom is not a private chamber sealed off from philosophical discussion. It's the very laboratory where ethics and politics and creativity and sexual ethics can collide. In other words, that the sex lives of philosophers matter, and so do your sex lives. So, where does this leave us? Well, the story that began with Diogenes self-pleasuring in the agora ends with Foucault in the bathhouse and Deleuze building desiring machines. But in between, we've seen that sometimes philosophy's greatest ideas are often tangled up in its messiest desires. Theories of virtue or freedom or power are never written in the vacuum. They're also written in bedrooms, in scandals, and in heartbreaks. But there's a pattern here too. Over and over, we see the same struggle between desire as something to repress, desire as something to indulge, and desire as something to cultivate. From Diogenes' shamelessness to Augustine's shame, or from Abelard's hypocrisy to Heloise's defiance, from Rousseau's innocence to de Sade's depravity, all the way through Beauvoir's ambiguities and Russell's jealous liberalism, the question is the same. What do we do with what we want? And maybe that's the real lesson. Sexual ethics isn't about finding a single formula, like chastity or liberation or free love. It's about living with the contradictions and cultivating the pleasures without letting them consume us. About acknowledging that the things we want can hurt us, free us, and make us human all at once. In short, the ancients said that sex was natural. The Christians said that it was sinful. The libertines said that it was pleasure, but shameful. And the moderns, with a few fits, starts, and misfires, said that it was freedom. And Foucault and Deleuze, our postmoderns, well, they said it's none of the above. Sex is power, sex is production, sex is experiment. It's a lot of things and it's everywhere. So let's not be afraid to talk about it. So yes, to answer our question, philosophers do bang, and quite a lot for a group of dry academics. As we've learned, they've had strange, sad, messy, sometimes liberating, and sometimes fulfilling sex lives. But so do we. The difference is most of us don't get to turn our kinks into world historical theories. Well, you can always try if you like. But that's it for now. So until next time, be wise and be kind. And maybe go easy on the whips for a while.
That's what she said. Oh, no,